So let's start, and then if somebody is late, he's going to join us later. First, thank you very much and welcome to everybody. My name is Ivan Krastev. I'm one of the permanent fellows here, and it is a great pleasure to invite you to our Geopolitical Talks. These talks we started several years ago, and the idea was that 3-4 times per year, we're really trying to invite an outstanding experts on certain area, particularly foreign policy, and trying to give us the big picture. How they see it from the point of view of what they know best, how the world is changing, how it can work. The previous speaker was the former National Security Advisor of the United States during the Biden administration, Jake Sullivan. Before it was Bill Burns. It was before he became the head of the American intelligence. But this was a combination of people, many of them with a lot of government experience. Indian foreign minister, Turkish foreign minister, and prime minister. So, and this is why it's a great privilege to invite somebody who was not in government yet. But the reason we decided to invite Andrew Small is that I do believe he's one of really the most interesting and influential experts on China, at least who is working in Europe. Andrew has an Irish passport, for those of you who hear his British accent. So when you learned that he was working for the European Commission, he had an Irish passport. He has graduated, his education comes from Oxford, and then he has been working in some of the leading think tanks, German Marshall Fund of the United States. Then when the European Commission decided to make her own expertise and to focus on China, he was one of the very few people that have been invited by the President von der Leyen to work with her, particularly on the problem of European policy on China, and not simply European policies on China, but also European policies in China in a connections with the American policy on China, and basically triangle relations between the United States, Europe, and China. His first book was very much on the China-Pakistani relations. And in 2022, he published a book called Rupture, which was how basically American and European policy on China has been transformed. And this was one of the most quoted books. And as you know, these days we are not in deficit of book about China. So this is a real privilege to invite him, and the idea is really to try to ask him not to tell us what is happening in China. Nevertheless, that if there are questions about this, I'm sure that he'll be happy to answer, but also to try to see how particularly in the last 1 year, European policy on China is changing, American policy on China is changing, but also how China is seeing the United States and Europe today. The idea is that he's going to give his major talk for 35-40 minutes. It's really up to him. I'm going to follow up with 3 or 4 questions, and then we'll go for your questions. So, Andrew, a real pleasure being with you.
Thanks very much, Ivan, and really huge honor to both for the invitation from you and to join you here today, and to be in such exceptionally esteemed company, and I'm glad to understand why now, given the prominence of the gang who came before me on this. I'm going to begin by laying out the big picture on this triangle between the 3 sides. An alliance facing a profound rift, fears of a rapprochement between Moscow and Washington, a growing ideological divide between partners who had once seemed inseparable parts of the same political tradition, a power that had been deeply dependent on its more militarily and technologically advanced ally preparing to stand alone, strategic rivals sensing an opportunity while remaining wary about whether this breach is real or if the 2 sides' underlying political interests will pull them together again. I'm talking, if it was not obvious, about the early stages of the Sino-Soviet split. The odd thing in listening to debates now about whether a reverse Kissinger might be possible to wean Russia away from China is not only that this is not a remotely serious proposition, but that the echo in the present day is so clearly on the other side. This time the West is in a state of potential schism, while the China-Russia partnership is on its strongest footing in recent history, with a leader in Xi Jinping who seems extremely determined to ensure that the two sides do not repeat the mistakes that they made in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. For Xi, and in a narrow way for Putin, this is a moment of profound opportunity. Changes not seen in 100 years that we are driving together, as Xi famously put it in Moscow. Not only to roll back the liberal democratic political and security advances of the post-Cold War period, but beyond that, to the promise of the Atlantic Charter, and for China, even beyond that again, to break the hegemonic position the West has occupied since the 19th century, and even potentially to consign the liberal democracies to a weak, embattled rump, a kind of reverse 1989, the fate that communism faced decades earlier, the lowest and most traumatic point for the Chinese leadership in the aftermath of Tiananmen. Even if this outcome is far from inevitable, the goal, which a year or so looked extremely challenging for China, achievable only if it could prevail in the course of an intense struggle with the United States and its allies, now looks tantalizingly as if it might be within grasp in the strategic landscape that is currently emerging. Not because of any changes in China itself in this most recent period. Aside from the progress achieved in a few key technologies, such as the AI breakthrough with DeepSeek, the economic situation in China there still reflects significant weaknesses and near-term vulnerabilities. But because the United States, under the Trump administration, has exhibited significant tactical missteps in its showdown with China this year, which now give Beijing the breathing room it needs to address a number of those vulnerabilities and the political upper hand in the relationship. And because of an even bigger act of still ongoing self-sabotage to one of the main advantages that China believed the collective West had, with the Trump administration undercutting not only US alliances in Europe and Asia, but weakening ties with key partners in the developing world that will have a determining influence on what the global balance of power is in the decades to come. How did we get here? Until this year, I think there seemed to be two parallel stories underway, one on the Western side and one on the Chinese side. The first story, which started unfolding towards the tail end even of the Obama administration, reflected this dawning recognition in the collective West that the old policy framework that had been in place to deal with China had failed, and that the experiment in integration had come to an end. This framework is often, I would say, caricatured as reflecting a view that economic, technological, and political engagement would inevitably bring about political change in China. I think that view may have held in the 1990s when the idea that communist states would fail and that liberal democracy was the only success model was far more intuitive. But even by the 2000s, when the Chinese Communist Party already looked a lot more resilient, I would characterize that the old framework as having some rather different elements. That even with an authoritarian political system, our economies were relatively complementary and Western companies could make good money in China. That we were dealing with a relatively pragmatic Chinese leadership with whom we could do mutually agreeable business on a lot of global affairs, from Iran to North Korea to the global financial system. That China benefited from a stable economic and security order, even if it didn't like certain elements of it. So our ideological differences about liberal democracy could be somewhat set aside. And that the West had such a tremendous lead militarily, economically, and technologically that if there was no political change, if the assumptions were wrong, if China became a more disruptive force, if the Chinese economy no longer delivered the benefits that people had expected, we had time to correct course. The speed then with which a different consensus has emerged to this is actually quite remarkable. Over the course of a few years, without being prompted by a single event, an economic shock, an invasion, a war, a broad swathe of countries across the industrialized world have gone through the process of revisiting their fundamental assumptions about China, starting to overhaul the policies that govern their approach to China for decades, and beginning to cooperate openly with each other in their response. The fact that there wasn't a single cause, though, for this reassessment has been part of the problem. If there'd been a single crisis catalyst, it may have been possible to pull together a response among the advanced industrialized democracies more quickly and coherently. Instead, this happened in piecemeal fashion. You had a cluster of developments over several years. I'll use them shorthand, some of which you will recognize, some of which you may not. But Hong Kong, Xinjiang, the militarization of the South China Sea, Made in China 2020-25, the China shock economic analysis, the worsening threats to Taiwan, COVID, China's backing for the Russian invasion, the growing weaponization of the Chinese economy. All of this cumulatively contributed to a sense that our economies were no longer quite so complementary, that China's on a push for industrial dominance that will displace potentially entire sectors in the West, even deindustrialize our economies. And that we've been seeing a number of the consequences of the shift in China from an authoritarian but I think understood still to be relatively pragmatic China under the previous leadership, to a China that looked much more ideological and even, to some eyes, totalitarian in its instincts under Xi Jinping. A lot of this was not about specific events or political developments, though. It was an exercise in looking at the numbers. Analysts in the Department of Defense in the United States, trade analysts in Europe, looking through the military balance, the progress in key technologies, the economic scale, and realizing that we were running out of time, that China had caught up in a number of these areas, or in some areas surpassed the West, that our collective lead in all of these domains had shrunk, and that the economic and security implications were no longer this slightly over-the-horizon future prospect. They were starting to come at us very fast right now. But I think the pace of this realization about China was not the same. The US got there faster, as did certain of China's neighbors. Europe was slower. A common conversation that you used to have with people in the Biden administration was, you are somewhere between 1 and 2 years behind us. We see where you are in your analysis, and we sort of sympathize with it because this was us quite recently, so we understand where you're coming from, but you will get to where we are too. The slowness on the European side did partly reflect geography. Europe, of course, feels less threatened by China's military buildup, less likely to find itself in the front lines of a war. It partly reflected the nature of the economic relationship. If you look at who were the real beneficiaries in the prior decade of China's economic growth, German industry in particular had been an enormous beneficiary through this period of time, for far longer than a number of other economies, not just in Europe, but in the industrial United States as well. And the reluctance to give that up was significant. But there was also, I think, a deeper attachment in Europe to a way the international order worked that has made European policymakers more reluctant to change. Because what was implied by all of this, by this rethink on China, was not really mostly about changing China policy. China policy itself is a very limited domain in the grand scheme of things. It was rather about changing how we related to the international trading system, how we ran our economies, how we thought about security risks. And for some European policymakers, rather than pivoting quite hard in light of the changing facts that they were seeing, they often dug in harder. There was not a fundamental reassessment of whether the WTO was fit for these conditions. They still held on for a long time to their version of what is rational and what is China's interest, rather than the one that Xi Jinping has laid out repeatedly. The hope, as with Putin, was that he might just adjust to our more rational way of seeing things. Even many of those who did accept that we needed to change their approach thought we could do so at a relatively leisurely pace and that didn't really involve significant costs. If our reassessment of China was taking place in this sort of cumulative, piecemeal fashion, our policy response could as well. That this was a series of shifts that we could just gradually adjust to rather than a fundamental change in our external environment that was going to increasingly start transforming our internal environment too. So when the US moved more quickly in some of these areas, the typical response from Europe was, this is too much. Controls on semiconductors were a bit too far. Cutting Huawei out of 5G networks was a little bit excessive. Maybe we could mitigate the harm. Trade barriers on the US side are always too protectionist. Restrictions on Chinese inverters or Chinese connected vehicles, all too alarmist. We're not at war. Reducing dependencies on China had to be done only on a very limited basis and relatively slowly. It wasn't really in China's interest to use these dependencies against us. And really, the companies should set the pace. Who were we as governments to tell them what was in their interest? In every single one of these areas, the US jibe from the Biden administration gang was pretty much correct. Europe did reach the same place in the end on all of these areas, but years later, beyond the point where we had the opportunity to shape the policy framework among allies that was emerging in these areas, and in ways that invariably left Europe in a weaker position as a result, on everything from what we have now, the dependence of our rearmament efforts and our industry on Chinese rare earths, to the costs of removing Chinese digital firms from our infrastructure, all of this than if we had moved earlier. This is not to exaggerate the pace of the US moves. It certainly took time for the new consensus to emerge on the US side too. But I'd say between the late stages of the first Trump administration and the Biden administration, we did see a pretty clear consensus emerging, really across both political parties, and including a lot of the MAGA Trump world as well. And I characterize the consensus on the US side in this way. First of all, a deeply integrated view of the economic, military, and technological challenge that China now poses, which required a whole-of-system response, outcompeting China on AI, sustaining a viable industrial base, addressing weaponizable dependencies, maintaining military edge in Asia, all of these highly intertwined goals cutting across multiple domains. Economic policymakers needed to be absorbed with security. Security policymakers needed to be absorbed with economics. Everyone needed to be absorbed with tech. All the fields between these lines have become extremely blurred. Second, that there is a major deterrence challenge in the coming years over Taiwan, given the huge Chinese military buildup that could see the United States at war and potentially a world at war too. It doesn't necessarily mean it would happen in 2027 or 2028, which is Xi Jinping's readiness deadline for the PLA, but clear that there was an exceptionally elevated risk in the coming years. Third, the Chinese economic practices, including the current huge excess capacities across an incredible array of different sectors, pose a real threat to the future of many US industries and indeed many industries globally. And that there's no longer a market-based international trading order that you can see if you're competing with the entire Chinese system rather than individual profit-seeking firms. And finally, that you couldn't do this as the US alone. That an effective US approach to China required allies, not just in the military domain, but to coordinate economic and technology policies that would have a crucial effect on the underlying power positions of the different sides. You can't set policies on semiconductors or telecoms solely in the US. You have to deal with an entire ecosystem across Asia and Europe. And when it came to China's catch-up, the collective economic weight of the advanced industrial democracies still vastly outstripped China. China could match the United States or the EU on scale as peer-level economies and potentially surpass them. But as a collective, if we were able to pull together, we retained a tremendous lead. And I would say by last year, despite some gaps between Europe and the US, I think we were starting to reach some level of convergence on all of this. Helped, I think, on the European side by the shifting sense of military threat relating to China, resulting from the crucial backing that China provided to Russia. And I think a shifting sense of economic threat resulting from this historically unprecedented level of Chinese export surpluses that were already starting to hit key sectors of the European and in particular, and finally, the German economy, the so-called second China shock. As Ivan mentioned, one of my last jobs when I was at the European Commission, working on the preparations for the incoming US administration, was coming up with an outline for what a significantly expanded framework for transatlantic cooperation on China would look like. And the way I characterize the understanding on the European side, certainly in Brussels, but a lot of work was done to get member states on board with this as well. The view going into the elections and the aftermath on the future outlook for the transatlantic relationship and how China fitted together with this, I'd characterize as follows. First of all, that the burden on the US globally was growing. And that there would need to be there would be greater need for the US to rebalance further towards the Indo-Pacific, especially, though not only because of these heightened Taiwan-related risks in the next few years. That the Europeans had the means to step up and should do so, and that US patience with the existing framework was running out. that the primary European focus and most important contribution would be a major scaling up of responsibilities in the Euro-Atlantic theatre, including support to Ukraine itself and Europe's broader defence commitments, which would take some time, and where we needed to figure out a well-managed transition between the two sides to deal with the capabilities gaps. But also that the two most important strategic theatres in Europe and Asia were intertwined, that contributions to deterrence in Asia mattered very directly to European interests, given the huge economic costs to Europe of any of the contingencies that we might see happening there, and that there needed to be a step change in the level of coordination on China, trade, and economic security if we weren't going to lose significant parts of our industrial base and future industries to Chinese practices and overcapacities, which would also, in turn, have significant material implications for China's military capabilities. So we would basically need to go sector by sector, US and EU, to work out what measures the two largest economies in the world would take to address that. Certainly a lot of China-focused defensive measures, but also openness to figuring out what bilateral moves needed to be made on the trade side too, to put our economic relationship on a very different footing, and then build out on this from the US-EU to the G7 and beyond. Which brings us, and will bring us to this year, 2025, when almost none of this happened, as you have probably noticed. Before I get to that, though, I want more briefly to touch on the parallel process that was evolving on the Chinese side over the last decade and a half. Some of the most important changes that we've seen the manifestations of have really been about restoring the central role of the party under Xi Jinping. Which he was very much empowered to do when he became General Secretary of the party, even if he went, I think, rather farther than a number of his peers were comfortable with. And a lot of this is really embodied in Xi's reassessment of Deng Xiaoping's theory of the fall of the Soviet Union. Deng Xiaoping's theory was that it was because the people didn't get what they needed, that the party needed to double down on the path of economic reform to avoid the same fate. Xi Jinping, in 2009, visiting the same locations as the ones where Deng laid out his argument, had a different case that basically put party dominance at the core. That it was because the party had lost faith in its ideology and its history, that the army and state and society were depoliticized, that nobody was ready to use the instruments of dictatorship to retain power. And we saw over the last decade and longer the consequences of this shift in analysis. But this shouldn't just be personalized around Xi Jinping. We also saw a critical set of shifts in China beginning really after the global financial crisis, a moment best captured by Wang Qishan, who was then the Chinese vice premier, whose remarks to the US Treasury Secretary back then, Hank Paulson, as the crisis unfolded, "You were my teacher, but look at your system, Hank. We aren't sure we should be learning from you anymore." Really became emblematic of the mindset shift among Chinese elites. China's relative resilience through the crisis and the catastrophic failure of the various US masters of the universe to manage and regulate the financial and economic architecture that they had built had a number of profound effects on attitudes in Beijing. It was a view not only that the Chinese economy could succeed without financialization and giving up state control, but that this may be the better and more successful path, that the bias in the Chinese system and in the party towards production and planning and control could be a strength. This would go even further during the Trump administration, when we saw a decisive move towards setting the Chinese economy up on a very different footing for self-sufficiency, for resilience, and to put China in a position through large part by weaponizing the dependencies that others had on China to deter and punish any moves from others that would try to exploit China's weaknesses and vulnerabilities that China still knows it has, from semiconductors to its financial system. And to a certain extent, as we'll come on to coerce others into maintaining their own openness so that China can still sell into their markets and can still acquire the technologies it needs in a number of the areas where the gaps remain. This was also the phase in which China saw a shift in its power position so significant that it changed, I'd say, the fundamental debates in China about the course it should now pursue. That the era of Deng Xiaoping of hide your brightness and bide your time was over, and it was time for China to take a more assertive stance in favor of its interests. Alongside this, We also saw the beginning of a reassessment about China's principles of non-alignment. Non-alignment is often seen as some kind of deep and fundamental element of Beijing's strategy. In fact, it's only been true for a pretty discrete period of time. The PRC established security alliances in the early phase of the Cold War, then called by Mao leaning to one side when that made sense. It spread revolution during the middle phases of the Cold War when that was seen as strategically advantageous. And it leaned towards non-alignment and abjuring the spread of the revolution when this helped China normalize its relations with its neighbors, with the West, and ensure that it could extract the economic and technological benefits from them during this takeoff phase through the 80s and 90s. But this was not necessarily forever. Any more than not having overseas military bases was forever, any more than maintaining a minimum nuclear deterrent was forever, and we've seen the changes in all of these different areas too. China does not see it as advantageous to replicate the US alliance system. It doesn't want the risks and liabilities that come with formal security commitments of that sort, especially when you look at the list of countries that China might be obliged to support. But a set of quasi-alliances, deep military, technological, and intelligence ties that fall short of formal security commitments is a different matter. What some analysts have characterized as alliances as a 19th century politician might have recognized them, rather than this very treaty-based framework, the US conception that has emerged since the Second World War. And for Chinese alliance theorists, and certainly for Xi Jinping, Russia has been the single case above all others, where if they can lock in a certain quality of relationship, it has a huge multiplier effect for China's military capabilities, for its global reach, for its diplomatic influence, for its capacity to coerce, and most broadly, for its capacity to push back against the West. Much of Xi Jinping's foreign policy, and I would say the most successful part of Xi Jinping's foreign policy, has been focused on locking that in, taking advantage of moments of Russia's need, particularly after 2014 and again after 2022, to do that. And in the process, creating the basis for leadership of a broader coalition. There's a great quote from Hu Xijin that corralling a few dogs, even a pack, is easier with 2 lions than with 1. In this analogy, of course, Russia and China are the lions, and this other disaffected gang that you saw in Tianjin are the pack of dogs. What this added up to was a China preparing internally and externally for struggle, a concept that Xi Jinping has placed considerable stress on. The idea that this is an exceptionally testing period of time for China, given the hostile forces trying to contain it. But if China dared to struggle successfully, it should be confident about its prospects. The underlying analysis that has been in place, particularly in the phase after the financial crisis, the East was rising, the West was in decline, still held, even if China was running into resistance in the United States and elsewhere rather than acquiescence. If anyone has spent time in China during the Xi era, though, there were big question marks that you would run into with people. Was China casting its lot in with Russia and all of these other countries really the strategic course that it should be taking? And was the weaponization of the Chinese economy really the right move, given the miserable state the economy seemed to be heading towards, with a collapsing housing market, low consumption, deflation, huge overcapacities, dismal confidence levels? Even if Xi's political position was strong, there was a lot of uncertainty about the system, inside the system, about the course he seemed to be setting China on. Which then brings us to this year. If Europe had bet, as I think it did, on the US consensus on China holding, it hasn't. We knew Trump was at odds with important elements of that consensus. He doesn't draw a distinction between national security and trade, and he's willing to put everything on the table in negotiations. He doesn't care about Taiwan. He's happy doing purchasing and investment deals rather than these kind of more ambitious and complex deals that his trade policymakers would urge on him. He doesn't believe in allies when it comes to dealing with China. He thinks he can deal with China bilaterally entirely effectively. But we'd still seen certain elements of the US policy framework follow pretty consistent threads. The consensus was something the Trump people owned. They took credit for forming it in the first place. And we saw in the last Trump administration how a pretty like-minded group of policymakers were able to steer a strategic agenda on China, even amid the chaos of the way the last administration worked. And in, I would say, on China policy, a much less consensual environment in DC. Not this time. It's not just at the moment that there are different views on China within the Trump administration. It's that there's no process for reconciling them. So different China policies, some harder, some softer, some completely contradictory, essentially just coexist. The National Security Council, as people may know, has been virtually obliterated. There is nothing that resembles an interagency process on China. People change jobs every couple of months, and the jobs that were once the key positions in policy are now often irrelevant to policy making. There's been a massive ramp up in what we can generously describe as lobbying to wind back elements of the old China consensus. I think most obvious when it comes to advanced semiconductor sales, which required a full-scale intervention from Trump's cabinet to stop him raising it with Xi Jinping during their last meeting, and could still move ahead. And we saw this near destruction of the global infrastructure on democracy and civil society support that had, in important elements, become a lot more China-focused on the US side in recent years. And this is not just a DC process story. It's translated into two bigger things. One is the inept and damaging way in which the US approached the China tariffs and the subsequent negotiations earlier this year. A massive and badly judged escalation on the US side, followed not only by rapid capitulation in light of the Chinese countermeasures on rare earth exports that China had put in place, but a capitulation that then gave China really the upper hand in the negotiations that followed, including opening the door to talks on areas that it hadn't believed could be on the table, most importantly US export controls, which are now essentially frozen for the coming period. And secondly, it's made it virtually impossible to make any progress on what Europe had hoped to do, building an allied framework on China with the US. There will be some discrete areas where this happens to an extent, potentially even right now on rare earths at the G7, and it features in some narrow ways in the US trade negotiations, but really only as a way of closing a few loopholes rather than anything broader. The Trump administration has been largely unwilling to engage with European proposals on China, even to talk seriously about them, partly because Trump doesn't see the value in it, and partly because it's so hard to be clear what US-China policy right now actually is for the two sides even to construct an alliance around. For China, the success in facing the US down was achieved through precisely the playbook that Xi Jinping had laid out and that his internal critics had questioned. Demonstrate resilience and self-reliance, weaponize the economy. China's been able to showcase its own coalition building in pretty unabashed and self-confident fashion, as we saw in the show at the Shanghai Cooperation Organization Summit in Tianjin and the Chinese military parade in Beijing afterwards with Kim Jong-un and friends. This has been a vindication of sorts, and certainly emboldening for the Chinese side. China has watched US-China policy being undermined from within, and an unprecedented level of strain in how the US has been treating not only its allies, but many of the key developing actors that will be critical to how the global balance of power breaks. A clean sweep, pretty much, of the rest of the BRICS, and perhaps most damagingly of all, the US-India relationship. They've seen the US-led coalition seemingly, if not unraveling, at least being significantly weakened, entirely through self-sabotage. The struggle that China had anticipated with the US during this period has turned out not to be even that difficult through this phase. And for Europe, not only has it been left as the sort of belated, jilted suitor, finally turning to the US and saying, we're ready to do this on China, and finding that the US is no longer interested, but it's now left dealing with a Beijing that thinks, if these coercive tactics work on the US, why shouldn't we see what we can get from others too? When China extended its rare earth controls to Europe, and others too, and started making demands of Europe earlier this year that the European side should put on the table for negotiations even the limited steps that the EU had taken to mitigate the impact of China's export surge, the initial response was, this must be a mistake. We didn't do anything. Can't we work out an agreement? By last month, I think people understood that Europe was not just collateral damage, that China saw this as an opportunity to extend and consolidate its domination of the global industrial structures and go through this process of coercing Europe into maintaining a level of economic openness to Chinese products that has increasingly seemed like a threat to the European economy, distorting in the process not only European economic interests, but the political choices in Europe about how to deal with it. European leaders have been so understandably focused on the Trump administration and Ukraine for most of this year that there's been almost no time to think through the stance that Europe now needs to take on China. In the last couple of months, though, including at the last European Council, I would say this did reach near crisis level concerns, given the ramifications for European industry, especially when the Nexperia case that some of you may be familiar with was thrown in too on China's semiconductor exports. China, it seemed, could very quickly paralyze European industry by cutting off exports, and it was ready to do so. And Europe is years away from being able to wean itself off these dependencies in these sectors and in certain others as well, because despite the warnings that we had, we still seem to believe that China wouldn't pull the trigger because it wouldn't be in China's interest to do so. And so the choice suddenly started to look a few weeks ago like one between a quick or a slow death for some key industrial sectors in Europe. The deal that the US and China cut in Korea the other week is a reprieve. The deal that they cut to suspend these measures for a year. But basically, we now have this sword of Damocles hanging over European industry. And in the coming months, European leaders will have to make some pretty significant decisions about what happens next. What are the potential pathways this could take? One version of this is fatalism. We basically acquiesce to China's dominance and monopoly power over a range of these different sectors of the value chain, from rare earths to green tech to machine tools to our energy grids to our telecom networks to increasingly large parts of the automotive sector as well. And of course, the coercive power over a number of critical political and security decisions that would follow from this. China-driven deindustrialization is not so bad, I learned in The Economist this week, which makes the argument for why Europe should accept China-driven deindustrialization because it will not be so economically costly. And there are a number of people in industry who basically say, we just have to accept this. Anything else will cost too much. It's too late to do anything about it. So when I say that there is a fatalist option, I don't say this as a caricature. I think there is a strong strand of thinking that says that this is the way that we have to approach the situation. The second approach is self-deception. We do enough to feel that we're doing something, but not enough to change the fundamentals. And I'd say this has been our approach so far. The number of times European political leaders have said, we are not naive, and then come up with some supposedly ingenious way to rebalance China's approach on Russia or economic deals because we believe that Xi is going to change the way that the Chinese economy is run, or how limited de-risking will be sufficient, and then we've fallen short. I would struggle to count in recent years. The third is that in the year ahead, we try to move ahead with the speed and scale required by the stakes. We put ourselves on the kind of sustained crisis-style footing that our approach to China needs if it's going to get anywhere. We try to build allied scale frameworks on trade, economic security, supply chains, climate, defense industrial cooperation, with a very different cluster of actors, the CPTPP economies, Korea, India, all of whom are navigating their own China challenges, and a similarly messy set of dynamics with the Trump administration. If the US is part of some of these frameworks, as it may be on rare earths, so much the better. But if not, Europe can't wait and hope that the volatility and incoherence that we're seeing in the Trump administration on China will settle down. We draw a protective ring around the industries that we don't want to see wiped out. And we assess the risks to our infrastructure as if we are preparing for the potential war in Europe that we say we are, which means that if Russia's closest strategic partner is in a position to disable our energy grid, our telecoms networks, and our transportation networks with literal clicks of a few buttons, that's something we need to fix. I will say, having been working on this particular triangle since the early 2000s, it's been rare to see so many people among officials and leading experts converge analytically on some of the fundamental points about China itself and where it's headed, about the situation that Europe faces, and even quite a lot of what needs to happen. I think there is a real belief, even if not all of this debate is playing out with this level of intensity in public, that we are at an inflection point on China in Europe. But what there is not is a political consensus about the risks that people are willing to take in the near term to get there, especially given Beijing's now demonstrated capacity and willingness to incapacitate European industries. And this fear that the Chinese side is in a more robust and resilient place to absorb any pressure and pain. I question that. I think Europe and a number of other countries are in a far more robust position to defend their economic and security interests than they seem to believe. So I will finish by quoting Xi Jinping again on the collapse of the Soviet Union, where his concluding line was, "In the end, nobody was a real man. Nobody came out to resist." I suspect his assessment of where the liberal democracies in Europe are headed right now is pretty similar. And I think it's time to prove him wrong. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. And my first question is, listening to you basically giving different stages of making American then European policy on China, it so much reminds me basically of the stages of developing American and European policy on Russia. Absolutely the same. They are not going to do it because it's not in their interest. And then basically when you see a major kind of a crisis like the annexation of Crimea, saying, listen, okay, this is the red line, they cannot go anymore, and so on and so on. So from this point of view, probably there is a structural problem in our understanding of how the world politics is changing. And the structural problem is that we have so much invested in the post-Cold War system that we are not ready to accept that anybody basically is going to challenge it or is unhappy with it. And for me, this is also an intellectual issue. In a certain way, you're so much in the system that you cannot understand that probably others don't like it so much as you do. And don't feel. I'm saying this because when I was listening to you, I was trying to imagine that basically you're a politician and try to sell this to the broader public. And the selling point is, listen, we are going to have a very much difficult struggle with Russia. We are going basically to have 5% of our GDP spent on defense. And now I have a good news for you. We're also going to fight China. And fighting China is going to be even much more kind of a costly, because when it comes to the economy, when it is happening, almost 90% of a certain type of our renewable industries are totally dependent on Chinese technologies. And even talking about the war in Ukraine, when you talk to some of the military commanders in Ukraine, they said what we're really fearing is not American dependence, but China dependence, because all these drones are done by a cheap elements that are basically done from on the Chinese market. I'm saying all this because what you're saying is, and this is my major question, and then I'm going to have just one. You're saying is it's time, get tougher. Can you do it if we don't know what is American policy toward China? Can Europe take the lead on China in the way we tried basically to take the lead on Russia, where in a certain way our position is much weaker, our interest is kind of a much more distant? Because my question is, do we know what Trump wants on China? And this is the biggest issue. Europe betted on the fact that we know what he wants. So when he came, we said it's going to be difficult, but he needs us on China, so we have a leverage. And then he comes and said, but you don't know what I have in mind on China. So what is the different scenarios on American policies on China that you can see in the next 2 or 3 years?
So first of all, I think we have been in this waiting period on the US side exactly because we are trying to see what the contours of this are. We'd hoped it would be a version that we can align with. That was the sort of first preference. But I think there was still a view that was, if clarity emerges in another direction, at least we can position ourselves around this. I think we have to deal with a situation in which we will not have clarity emerging. That this dynamic that we're seeing, this kind of rotating process of temporary truce that's broken, things unravel. We think Trump is about to cut a deal. He isn't. Someone stops him. There is a deal. It's undercut. This is the sort of dynamic that I expect we're going to see for the next period. And so we can't wait for this. And we have to be clear that we can't wait for this and make some decisions where we're going to be affected by all of these things, of course, as well. I mean, we have just been affected in a dramatic way by US-China dynamics amid all of this volatility on the trade side and on the rare earth side. This wouldn't have happened in this manner had the US-China dynamics not played out the way that they did. So we can't hide from it, and we can go through the list of all the different things that can possibly play out. I mean, I can answer that bit of things as well, but we also just need to define a framework where it is a non-US centric framework. We have to have clarity about a European set of interests that are now more distinct, because I always pushed back against the view that they were so different on some of these questions in the past. At the moment, if we care about our green tech sector, the US does not care about our green tech sector. If we think that one of the most fundamental questions in terms of the risks on for Europe is about the China-Russia relationship, this administration does not care about the China-Russia relationship in the same way as its predecessor did. It does not understand the security stakes relating to this in the same way. And so if our chief security concern with China is this, and our economic concerns now do not look identical to the US, we're going to have to define an approach that's based around some of these focal points, and that is still resilient against a number of the dynamics that we're likely to see with the US. I don't necessarily think what this is just get tough, get harder, punch back. I'm not necessarily sure that it will look like this, or it can look like this, because the coercive capacity on the Chinese side is real. We don't want to go through the exercise that we have just seen earlier this year between the US and China. This will not work. We're going to have to play this in a very different way if we're going to if we're going to get the framework that we need for this in place. And that's nonetheless one that is going to involve some element of a willingness to go to the Chinese side on a few industrial areas and be willing to take measures that look quite different from the ones that we've taken before. But a number of these things are also going to be things that we do with, as I say, a different group of economies and states that, if you're looking at economic scale on this, do add up in aggregate to still a collective that dwarfs China. And I mean, I think the problem with this is we have understandably been hugely transatlantic centric. We look over the shoulder for all of our judgment calls to the US on the security, strategic, industrial elements of this. In practice on this, we're going to have to shift into, I mean, we don't even have a fully functioning G7 on some of these things anymore. The constellations that we're talking about are quite peculiar. If you look at the group that met at the G20 for their joint statement, it's a cluster of Asian economies, it's a cluster of European economies, it's the Canadians. I mean, this is why EU TPP, a bizarre constellation in ordinary conditions, but a group that basically gathers a lot of these economies who have roughly similar views on a lot of these questions, is something that people are now thinking about more seriously. But this is a very different version of how you do collective policy on these things than the one that we were preparing for or thought was worth anyone's time. But on some of these areas, it's going to be something that Europe will just have to do itself. If we want to set cyber rules across our economies to deal with what we think might be the vulnerabilities that could result in the case of war, we will just have to do that. And there may be certain forms of pressure that come for us from the Chinese side, but that's something we're going to have to push on through. And I think, notwithstanding my criticisms and questions about where the European side and European political leaders in a number of cases are on this, we have started to see some of these moves starting to take place. We have started to see these reassessments. I don't think this is out with the bounds of possibility that we can move further and faster to define our interests with a greater level of sharpness and move much faster on the thing that everyone had been resisting because they believed, as you said at the beginning, China won't do this. It's not in their interests. It's not in China's interests to debilitate a telecoms network, because then no one will buy telecoms networks from China again. It's not in China's interest to cut off rare earths, because then people will find alternative supplies. The problem is you have a period of 5, 6, 7 years before you can put yourself in the position to do that. And it's a window of tremendous vulnerability. And that is, of course, what China's counting on. They've set the clock. They know the clock is running on this, but they think that this critical window is the one that they need, and that in some sense or other time is on their side with this.
So this is very important, because my second question is very much about how China sees us. And these comparisons that you are talking about, the Chinese analysis of the collapse of the Soviet Union, I find critically important, because if somebody did a really interesting analysis of the collapse of the Soviet Union, this was the Chinese. Because for them, this was not a historical necessity. This was a series of policy mistakes. There was a special 6-episode documentary which was shown in every single organization of the Chinese Communist Party, explaining why and how the Soviet Union collapsed. And I found this critically important, because this window of vulnerability, and you're right, by the way, if we want to be gracious towards Trump, we can say that he's buying time. He's trying to confuse the Chinese of what they want and so on, because he believes that America has time. You always can find a way to rationalize when you don't understand what people are doing. But I'm saying this because if you are right, and this analysis is right, the next 3, 4, 5 years could be the most tense. First, Taiwan. How you're going to read basically the heating up of the Chinese-Japanese discussion on Taiwan. To what extent, basically, the Chinese analysis is that the Trump administration is not going to risk to go in a military confrontation if the Chinese decide to do something. And secondly, this is my last question. I was always asking myself in every policy, what is the thing that I don't understand most? Because other things you probably don't understand, but you have the feeling that you understand. You simply understand them wrongly. But there is certain thing that puzzles you. And the thing about Trump administrations that I'm most puzzled is India policy. For 20 years, different American administrations, including the first Trump administration, invested incredibly of building out of India the main strategic partner and ally of the United States when it comes basically dealing with China in Asia. And this was not simply kind of a different military arrangements, but particularly this was an economic arrangement which were going to push American companies that have been producing in China to move to produce basically in India. Of course, Vietnam was also one of them. And then suddenly you end up with such a tariff policy towards India that you simply cannot understand. Because imagine that you're a CEO of Apple. I'm sure that all of you have been putting yourself in this position. And you have been basically pushed for years. Get out of China, move to India. And getting out of China is not low-cost exercise. And getting into India and producing in India is also not a lot of fun. And the moment you start doing this, you end up with the tariffs, 50%, which is just killing. So try to give me a sense of this. So for me, the story is, should be worried most for the next 3 or 4 years in the relationship? How are you seeing Taiwan? And secondly, if you can explain for me the India puzzle, then I'm going to the to the others to ask their questions.
So the buying time thing, I think, is important, because this is exactly now what you hear from people in the US administration. You now need to buy time. We need to buy a year. This matters. It matters on the Chinese side as well. I think this has been the thing for both sides. China is in a much weaker position economically, as I've mentioned. I mean, nominally growth rates are at 5%. They're not at 5%. Growth rates are substantially lower than that. I think any Chinese economists in private, most Western economists would put growth levels at 1.5 to 2, even lower. This kind of zone, 2.5 max. the economic conditions, if you go down all of the indicators in the Chinese economy, it is in a very weak spot at the moment, very export dependent, much more so than it was. The only sort of real sources of growth right now are state-backed financing and exports. Every other thing looks flat. And you still have these obvious deficits. If you look at semiconductor manufacturing, if you look at the resilience of the Chinese financial system, could they navigate sanctions in worst case scenarios? There's a few of these areas in which they know they have gaps to close. How quickly they close them you can debate, but there's a real window that they need to be able to do this effectively. So some element of buying time is important there. And on the US side, I mean, DoD had already set a target for the US military on rare earth dependence, for instance, a much faster one than European militaries, again. So I think there you can see this sort of set of calculations around, what happens in the next year, what happens in the next 2 years, what happens in the next 5 years. The question for me, as soon as I saw the clock starting on rare earths, was precisely the Taiwan question, because I've been debating this earlier in the year. What's the point at which it just makes sense to pull the trigger on a number of these things? Because if you think that this is the critical 5-year window, if you're looking at a phase after the next Taiwanese elections, I mean, 2027 is always the date that people had bandied around, the readiness date for the PLA. I think a lot of people are more worried about the phase beyond the next Taiwanese elections in particular. If the DPP, the Democratic Party, wins again, then I think the analysis on the Chinese side will be there is no political solution anymore. That it's the KMT, if they cannot come back to power this time, it's that version of things is over. On the other hand, if the KMT come to power, I think there is a view that potentially you have a route to again, not to keep using the word coerced, but in this case, it very much is coerced, a coerced outcome with parts of the KMT, particularly if they think the US won't be behind them and that there is a loss of confidence in that. But potentially also that you just end up with a window towards the late stages of this decade in which you have a convergence of analysis that there is a window to go to war. There's analysis on the Chinese side that there's a window to go to war. There's analysis on the Russian side that there's a window to go to war. And that if you're able to debilitate the Allied militaries through this period of time and put them in a weaker position, then their capacity to deter that is going to be much more limited. You can potentially even extend that window, particularly on the US side. So preventing this Allied buildup, which I think is going to be a consequence, if not necessarily an initial motivation on the Chinese side for these rare earth restrictions, will be one of the important ramifications. And I think it does mean it's an exceptionally risky phase. I'd say particularly once we get into that window towards the later stages of the decade. And on the European side, this is then going back to this question of if we believe that there is a war, if we believed in both of these war risks, because the other thing that's gone on the Chinese side is if there were to be a set of contingencies relating to Taiwan, military intervention in Taiwan, I think there's now much more concern on everyone's part that this will have ripple effects in other theatres, that you potentially have a Korean Peninsula scenario, that Japan will have to be engaged in other parts of the Pacific, but that it will be a window for Russia as well. It doesn't need to be coordinated intervention, it can be opportunistic, but that you have a real risk that you will see some simultaneity. And I mean, in the final stage of the Biden administration, I think it was a big push to get Europe to try and think this through, to try to address the question of preparing for simultaneity, essentially, in some of these scenarios. So I certainly think that this is, all of this has to be seen through the prism of timetables, years, windows, and calculated with reference to this with a pretty high level of clarity about what some of the choices mean and what the trade-offs are going to be. On the India side, I think, I mean, there's the obvious piece of this, which is the Modi unwillingness to credit Trump for bringing peace to South Asia. And to be fair, they Trump administration did play an important contributory part to stabilizing that situation. But I think it's been quite important to Modi and not to attribute external credit. It's been a pretty foundational approach that you don't do this, that this is something that can be managed bilaterally. This wasn't mediated, there wasn't external intervention. And I mean, as I think we discussed in another context before, I think the pride thing matters in this. There are a lot, I mean, in the end, on the European side, there's been a willingness to sort of suck it up and swallow pride and go and play this game with the administration, whatever people are saying in private about all of this. And there hasn't been the willingness to do that with Modi and with certain others as well. And I think that's an important part of it. But the other element to all of this is, again, if you don't think that it matters that you have partners and allies in all of this, why should you give India a pass on trade? Why should you give them a pass on all the other things they're up to that they were given exemptions for Iran, for Russia, for all of these other things? That's not the approach on the Trump side. He was very frustrated in the last administration on Harley-Davidson sales and things like this. There's a zone where he just expects to treat everyone the same way and doesn't think that this kind of bending over backwards, India exemptions and things is how the US should approach things, and that there shouldn't be any of the sensitivities to how India is going to react to the kind of tactics that he's employed with others as well. So I mean, it has unraveled a large part of the efforts politically that have been in place, exactly as you say, over decades on this, and in a place where a government in India that was very sympathetic to the Trump administration in all sorts of ways, and a public that was very sympathetic to Trump as well. So it feels like probably the biggest act of self-sabotage. Now, India is still in a position where the fundamentals of its relationship with China still mean that for all the images of Modi in Tianjin, there's not going to be some big China-India rapprochement or anything. I mean, there's limits to the consequences of this. But I think this question, India played such a crucial role in, I mean, what Jaishankar, the Indian foreign minister, characterized as the distinction between the non-West and the anti-West. India was part of marshalling a non-West in institutions like the SCO and the BRICS against the anti-Western tendencies that you were seeing from China, Russia increasingly in recent years. How much effort to put into that at the moment, I think, is in question. Or do you see, if you are sitting as India, Brazil, a value in building up some of these institutions differently against sanctions resilience and pressure from the US, alternative frameworks on trade, currency, a number of these other things, all of the things that the US in the previous administration had seen as the kind of the hinge question. Oh, we'll lose the Saudis because they'll de-dollarize their oil sales, and like all of these questions about what does the overall balance of financial and economic power look like. These are some of the areas in which you may get a tilt in a different direction, and I think that's you see those debates blowing up on the Indian side, in Brazil and elsewhere about what those choices need to look like in the next period of time. And that would amount to a real strategic loss for the US and for the West, arguably, as well.
Thank you very much. We're going to have, in my view, 15-20 minutes for conversation. So my idea is then not to take one question only and him to respond, but to take 3 or 4. So there are going to be more possibility. Please. Just a minute, yeah. And if you decide to introduce yourself, just to know from where the conversation comes from.
All right. My name is Jeff Manners, American and Belgian. And from my professional background, I'm a semi-retired insurance executive who's worked extensively across Central and Eastern Europe. I'm curious about your views on the stability of the Russo-Sino relationship, of what are its vulnerabilities, if there are any. And 2, I believe China must have a lot of historical grievances as well vis-a-vis Russia from its treatment in the 19th century. And 2, is China overplaying its hands, for example, in the trade relationships now? I presume China's getting the discount basement prices on oil and probably other resources as well. And if these vulnerabilities exist, what can the EU or the US do to exploit them?
Thank you very much. There was a question behind, yeah.
Anselm Spurry, Rutgers University. Two questions. One is, give me an argument what speaks for China to invade Taiwan and do it soon. From my perspective, if you just look at AI, how critical Taiwan is in the AI equation, and for America, this would be a sweet way to take the air out of that. And the second question is, why not for Europe to join China and make an explicit arrangement and saying, thank you very much, America.
Thank you very much. There was a question here. Yeah.
My name is Dalia Marin. I'm originally Austrian, but I'm living in Germany at the Technical University of Munich. But today, now I'm visiting Central European University, which is located in Vienna. So I wanted to come back to Europe and your assessment of how Europe should respond to China. And one of your possibilities is to be fatalistic and say, okay, we accept the Chinese China shock, and they have so many coercive power, the Chinese now, with the rare earth material and so on. So they are capable of destroying us, and we just have to accept deindustrialization. We know what happened in the US with the China shock. You know, we got Trump. I mean, this is what research now shows. So if we pursue this fatalistic perspective, then this is what is going to happen in Europe. Extreme right-wing parties all over the place, because until now, they are not in Germany, in spite of the fact that we have the second China shock. And actually, it's even worse. I wouldn't call it the second China shock, because it's a China shock that is much more severe than the first China shock in the US, because the first China shock in the US, that was furniture, clothing, textiles, but this China shock now in Germany, this is the core of the German industry. So it means really to kill the economy. So I wanted to say, you know, the Europeans have also coercive power. You don't have to accept everything. For instance, what the Europeans have to offer is a big market that the Chinese are desperate to enter, because basically the American market is closed. And so this is the coercive power that Germany has and Europe has to take in an aggressive way and see what can be arranged. So I was actually suggesting that Europe should reverse engineer Chinese industrial policy. What did the Chinese do to become world leaders in green tech? They basically got the Germans in and asked the Germans to produce in joint ventures. That was their way of absorbing the technology by being in the same firm. So you can't hide the technology if you are working in the same firm. So what I was suggesting is reverse engineer this strategy. Tell the Chinese, okay, you can enter our market, but the condition is you produce in this, you form a joint venture with a European firm, and you make sure, and you have to work out the details.
It's slightly collector. It's a very important question that you're asking, but in my view, in order to get at least one more question, let's get the question. No, you have a very valid point, absolutely valid point. The last question goes there.
Thank you. Ina Beraskina, School of Civic Education. Originally, I'm from Russia, and I'm current fellow here at the Institute. What do you think is the end game for China in the Arctic? Because obviously China is trying to get there using Russia as a proxy. So military, Northern Silk Road, nuclear weapons, anything that we are not looking at.
Thank you very much. So you have a really interesting question because they're pushing about choices and so on. Are we siding with China and what it means, by the way? This is a choice. And then if we decide to follow this aggressive story, and then you have the Arctic and you have basically the Russia-China relations, and you have 8 minutes. and then we're voting.
So, I mean, on the China-Russia question, in a way this is short because I don't think we can exploit the vulnerabilities. They are there. There are the historical issues. All of these things exist. And then you go through the lists on presence of China in Eastern Russia and Central Asia, and you can go through and pull all of these things out. There was a point in which we, I think, did the analysis and said these will exist as real gaps between the two sides, as pressure points, and this will lead to the two sides coming apart. There was a certain point in which this just stopped being true. And I think a lot of this is the way Xi Jinping has handled it. Even the way, as you referenced on the trade side, there was a juncture in which Xi Jinping's edict to Chinese companies after the Crimea annexation was, don't negotiate excessively hard. Do good deals, but not deals that make the Russian side feel like they've been squashed against the wall. There's higher strategic stakes in this. And so, yes, they still do good deals. They still negotiate good arrangements. But do they feel exploitative and damaging to the dynamics? No, I don't necessarily think they do. And I think there's been a fundamental approach, which is there are more important things than these differences on both sides in different ways. There's enough that you can set aside. And so, I mean, there was a certain point in which I certainly argued to people, stop going through and saying these are the limits, these are the problems, these are the things the two sides won't do together. Go through and look at the list of what's next. What have they not done but still could do? Because we've kept being wrong in the wrong direction. We've kept saying that there are these obstacles and differences and things. And every single time, it's rather they've moved into new domains, including the Arctic, and all the list of things that had previously not been, I mean, that's still on the list, I would say, of the areas that have not yet been fully explored yet, but where China has certain demands that Russia may be willing to move on differently. China has a kind of wide-ranging, global, indeterminately, it's a sort of everything agenda in any of these places. It's sea routes, it's natural resources, it's access, they just sort of see what's there and what can be obtained and obtain options. I don't think it's a huge strategic priority on the Chinese side in the grand scheme of things. I think it's something they're ready to take advantage of the opportunities that are afforded, but neither is it something that they, I would say, push excessively on the Russian side. But it is on this long list of areas of the new threshold crossing pieces that they have moved further and further and further into. So I'm afraid I think we just have to adjust to what some of these things look like, rather than assuming that we can kind of throw grit in. On the Europe-China side, I think the conception on the Chinese side of where the Europeans sit on this is that they are on the other side. We don't realize that we're on the other side. We at points go to China and say, can we cut a deal? Why are we not being treated differently from the Americans? We're nicer than the Americans. We're not doing the same things as the Americans. Why can't we figure out a different arrangement? And again, we get the same result. Now, there's one version of the analysis that is that China just thinks it can get what it wants with the Europeans without having to give anything up. There's another analysis that says in the collective struggle against the West, we are just on the wrong side of this. We are part of the liberal democratic world, the framework that they want to see ending in some sense or other, or weakened, or however you would like to characterize this. When China comes out with all of its global initiatives, Europe is not in these. there used to be a pretense that Europe was still part of these frameworks, Belt and Road and things like that. Europe is not in these frameworks anymore. It's the developing world that is in these global initiatives. And so I think we have tried on the European side to go back to China and say, even this year, I think we went back to say, can we cut some kind of a somewhat pragmatic deal given the problems we're all dealing with? And the approach on the Chinese side was no. You're in a weak position. You should give us more. And so I think it's not viable at the moment, and I think people have tried the more limited version of this, and I think it's not possible. I'll come to the AI bit, and then, and Taiwan, but on this China shock piece and what is also called by some people the reverse dung on the investment question. Basically, can you go through and replicate the Chinese playbook on this? And I completely agree with everything that you said on the China shock. It's a mischaracterization to call it the second China shock in a way, because it's all of the old sectors, all of the low value sectors, and all of the future industrial sectors. It's totally sweeping. It's on a much, much bigger scale. And the numbers are just dwarf anything that was going on before, which was much more concentrated in certain industries. And the overcapacities at earlier phases after 2008, 2010, things like that, also much more concentrated. This is so wide-ranging. And so the impact is much bigger. And precisely what you point out, this has political impact on a certain level. The original China shock analysis was how this concentrated and high-speed version of deindustrialization has political ramifications that are lasting and bolster the far right, bolster all of these dynamics, which are, of course, already underway, and that this basically helps turbocharge. And so I think on the political understanding in Europe of what is at stake if you don't get this right, this is what is at stake. So when you see political leaders who say, my entire focus is ensuring that the far right don't come to power in, including Germany, if you're not getting this piece right, you are undermining the economic fundamentals that will ultimately have this extremely destructive influence on where that heads. I'm not completely... The problem on the investment piece is, on the Chinese side, they're very attuned to the fact that this is what people are going to try to do, and they're very determined not to let it happen. I think we should put all sorts of investment conditionalities in place. I think it's worth trying. I think we're probably going to go through with some new proposals even in a few weeks' time that will come out from the European Commission to lay out how this might be done. I think it makes sense to try and put high standards in place rather than having the sort of low-value investments that you've seen in Hungary and in Spain and others. I think it makes sense to try to get these things. I'm very skeptical that we will accomplish it because the ministries on the Chinese side right now are forensically focused on making sure that the technologies that matter are not going to be transferred through any of these sorts of arrangements. So I think but I buy the rest of the argument. Finally, on Taiwan and the AI question, I think the one thing on the Chinese side right now is it was the big shift this year where the US, the confidence on the Silicon Valley side last year that China was nowhere, that the US was moving ahead again, and on the Chinese side, the concern that this was now another foundational industry that the US was just going to completely dominate. I think the psychological effect of DeepSeek was important for that, and of course it's now gone much beyond DeepSeek in terms of the successful models that we're seeing on the Chinese side. I think this has given a certain level of confidence. It's still, you have a lot of emphasis in the most recent plenum on 0-to-1 innovation. There's still a view that if China can make breakthroughs in some of these sectors, and when we're looking at these timeframes, part of the view, I think, on the Chinese government side is there are going to be areas where we accomplish total leadership. There's going to be people coming to us for some of these technologies who need these new technologies. We're not even sure exactly which of these sectors. I mean, we see it in green tech, you see it in certain areas already, but there's going to be more. We're going to be the technological leaders, and the balance of all of this will shift significantly if that's the case. AI now, I think there's much more confidence that you don't need to destroy and move fast to debilitate the US in this area. That this is still something where China, particularly given the adoption rates and things that we're seeing there, but the accomplishments that they're making in some of these models is moving at a pace that I think people are now much more comfortable with on the Chinese side. And you look at the energy costs that they're pulling down to make this possible. I don't think they need to take these sorts of actions for the reason that you outlined. There may be other contingent reasons to act on Taiwan at an earlier date, but the PLA is not ready yet. The generals are being constantly purged right now. And I think there's still a view on the Chinese side that there is an outcome that you can accomplish there that doesn't involve war. And it's only when you've exhausted those options, which I think is why the Taiwanese elections are an important point, that you really, really need to contemplate that, unless something near-term, a kind of wild card blows up that means that you decide you have to act earlier.
Thank you very much. Normally in seminars like this, people said that we end up confused on a higher level. But I do believe that we should agree that one very important kind of a characteristic of this talk is giving a clarity. We can agree, we can disagree, but clarity was here, and I very much want you to praise Andrew for giving us this clarity.